Well, when you were talking, I don't know why it came to mind, but one of the things that it seems like among women, there's just a lot of belief that you should not cut your hair because the Bible says, "Do not cut your hair."
Yeah.
And as I understand it, back in Paul's day, women that were went to the temples to worship the different idols would cut their hair and they would give the hair to the idol, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that was their sacrifice of whatever to the idol. And so, as I understand it, I think it's saying that the women now are come to Christ, and they say, well, now, is there such a thing as we should cut our hair for him? And I think that, now I heard this a very long time ago, and I haven't heard it since, and nobody's discussed it since.
Yeah.
But it just came to mind anyway.
Yes, because you were saying something, and I'm not even sure what I hear. Hearing aids are driving me crazy right now.
Oh, sorry.
Do you have a hearing aid on?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
lucky
I
man.
heard a lot of kind of negative stuff.
You happy with it?
So we'll tackle that. So in Greek, that word is, and I'll write it in English, is kairo, which means to cut. It means like to shore, as in like to shorn. Shearing sheep. Okay. It can also mean, I think, to remove. Let me see. Yep, or the cutting of hair short. Yeah, to cut short really is really so. Like to shave your head, kind of mentality there. So, like for example, it's used in Acts 8:32. Like sheep, he was led to the slaughter. Like a lamb before the shearer is silent, he opened not his mouth. That's that word. In Acts 18:18, Paul uses this, saying that Paul stayed many days and then took leave of his brothers and set sail with him, Priscilla, and Aquila. And at Cenchreae, he cut his hair, for he was under a vow.
Which was something the men did.
Yeah, for a vow. Yep, they did it for a vow.
And what hair did they cut? Just beards?
Uh,
Or did
we'll
they
go-
cut the top of the
This song, he cut his hair off the head. But so here's the verse that we're looking at. It's 1 Corinthians 11:5 through 6. Okay, here's what it says. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is as the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or to shave her head, let her cover her head. So some...
That's probably why in my day, women wore hats to church.
Yep.
Well, and in the Catholic Church particularly, I don't think they still do it, but they also even wore a handkerchief over their head, just
A
something.
doily or something.
This like it causes some problems. So it doesn't what people in the do not cut hair camp, what they'll say is this means in any way cut at all.
Yes. and
That's what they will say. That's
I
not
think
what this
Navajo people, that's what they will say. They've never cut their hair since birth.
right. They take this cut short to shorn to cut whatever as cut at all in any way. It's not what that word means. As we've seen, it means shorn, like think cut short, like you would a sheep when you're shearing the wool off of it, like down to the skin, kind of cut. So the problem with using cut at all is that it fails to address what Paul means by covered and uncovered in these verses. So it's related to authority. Okay, that's what the covering, uncovering means. There's a simple exercise in logic that we can use to see the fallacy of this argument. In order to maintain that the argument that the passage teaches strictly uncut hair for women, one must hold that shorn does not mean to cut at all, but means to cut shortly or nearly shaved, which is the correct definition. So you have to make this leap from cut shorn to short, to even to shave, as in close to the skin, is the same thing as cut at all. Okay? That's the argument that they're making. These two do not equal the same thing.
Okay. Got it.
It's not, so it's like,
There is no instruction
if
at
like,
all that you have to, that you cannot have short hair.
so if this is A in logic, we would say this is not A. A cannot equal not A. Right? So this is a simple logical formula. If this is the definition, it doesn't mean that. Okay? So the ideology that we use when we look at this passage, we can see that we have to look at it this way and not it this way, because otherwise the passage doesn't make sense. We also run into an issue when we interpret this. If the scripture here means to cut it all, including trimming, then it would be okay for a man to grow his hair long as he kept it trimmed. But keep in mind that this is referring to the stance that women should not cut or trim their hair and that men should keep their hair cut short. As you can see from 1 Corinthians 11, this ends up creating a series of fallacies that gets itself into trouble. A series of fallacies that gets itself into trouble, because men are not supposed to keep their hair overly long, according to the law, because that's effeminate. So, yeah, you get into some weird territory where you're causing a bunch of contradictions.
Because if he's going to say that, he should say, well, men should not have their hair any longer than 8 inches from.
Right. Well, and that's so you'll get into some of the more charismatic movements will say, you know, the Holy Spirit is in the hair of a woman, and that's why they don't cut it, because otherwise the Spirit will depart her, like it did Samson, right? So there are some instances where this becomes problematic, and then we've got the other side of the aisle, which will say that men shouldn't have long hair at all, and that'll be kind of more like your IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist group that says men should always have short hair, because otherwise you're transversing into effeminate territory, and that's not good. So, whole lot to do about really what essentially is about head coverings.
But it's a subject that you would think would never ever be addressed. Why would anybody care what a person's hair looked like?
Right. So what is Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians? So the word uncovered comes from the Greek akataluptus, which means not uncovered, or not covered or unveiled. So it's a compound word, which is not with the word to hide or to veil. So it comes from kind of the same family of words as apocalypsis, which is revelation, or apocalypse. It comes from that same family of words. With that in mind, what it becomes apparent that Paul is referring to is the custom of veiling. So if we look at the Greco-Roman culture, the practice of the veiling among married women was very common. Okay, it was a mark of their status. So we know this from history and paintings of Christian women on murals, walls, and catacombs, and other Christian work. What is the purpose of the veil for married women? Notice the words married women, because the practice of veiling was only for married women, not for single women. Again, it was kind of like a wedding ring. It was a sign that you were married. For example, in the Amish culture, men don't wear jewelry. So the way that you show that you're married in the Amish culture as a man is you start growing a beard. You're not allowed to grow a beard until you're married. Okay? Women then, there's I forget what the thing is for women, but that's for men. When you see a bearded Amish man, it's because he's married. If it's a short beard, he's been married recently. Okay? There you go. But yeah, so that's a woman's hair is considered to be sensual. That's why it had to be covered. A thing of beauty to be hidden away from other men, lest they be caused to lust and married after a married woman for sin. This is one of the reasons why women cover up their hair in Middle Eastern cultures, which is very, it's very close to, they're all Abrahamic people groups, they're all Semitic. So they all have kind of similar customs. But in the Middle East, this is why culture, it's a sin issue for women not to cover their hair because it caused other men to lust and, all that kind of stuff. So a Jewish Orthodox woman who practices veiling, who do not wish to veil their hair, will often shave their heads. Okay? Just like Paul makes reference to in 1 Corinthians 11. It is interesting to note is that since it is a legal issue, the legal issue here is hair and its sensuality, a woman can shave her hair and then just wear a wig because technically it isn't her actual hair and thus the law is kept. Okay?
It is all human. I mean, how about the Sikh religion? The man is not allowed to cut their hair.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
They have to roll it up in the turban.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's the issue of sensuality of the hair, which we don't really have that today. We don't have that as a problem. So the issue of the sensuality of the hair is what Paul is discussing here, and gives women the option to shave their heads according to the custom of the day. However, he also states that depending on the culture or traditions, it might be shameful for a woman to shave her head. So it would be better that she veiled or cover her head. Okay, so here's what Paul is telling women.
So we're not talking about then just a small veil. We're talking about like the Muslim women wear.
Yeah, so like if you ever see, like for example, how many images have you seen of Mary where she's got a covering over her head?
None.
All of them.
Yeah.
All of them. She's got a veil over her head.
Oh, just sort of a drape.
Yeah, you see, yeah.
Oh.
We're not talking like full on burqa. We're talking about just a head covering. Yeah.
But according to the Quran, the woman not even supposed to show their ankle.
Yeah.
You have to cover all the way below.
So like here, look. If we look, this is just typing in Mother Mary. Okay? In every single one of these, she's got her head covered. Because that's what you did back in that day. That's what he's talking about, veiling. So the Catholic Church understands the tradition here. And so in every one of these pictures, she's got a veil on her head.
But not needed because she has long hair.
But is the intent really just to
If
fit
you
in
ever
the
see
culture?
under the veil, it's a cultural.
So here's the thrust of it. Is Paul telling women that they shall veil their heads? Not entirely. It is important for us to realize that Paul is only talking about customs and traditions here, not salvation issues that will keep women out of heaven. When we read it in the context of the history and the traditions of that time, we realize that Paul is addressing how to follow the custom of veiling for married women.
And yet Paul brings in theological support for that, like verse 10.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just, hey, fit in with the customs so you don't kick up a lot of dust. It's more like he brings in a theological side to it.
Yeah, he does. But he's addressing that. So if you're married, you can cover your head, but your hair is sufficient, right? So he's getting at all of these different. He's addressing a cultural problem that we're having here at the time. Let me get to 1 Corinthians 11.
Okay. And the past you mentioned about heaping coals of fire on a person's head, seeming to be a negative thing, but I had heard at one point that
No,
that was blessing people.
It was a positive thing. Yeah, you're showing somebody who's giving you negative input, love and blessing and that kind of thing, and you're heaping, and in so doing, you're making them uncomfortable. Yeah, well, and you're doing that in order to make them uncomfortable, right? To show them the bad way that they're treating you and make them feel guilt and shame that they treated you so poorly.
Nice to them. And then I'm taking taking it that they had a pan on top of their head, and you put the hot coals on the head. So that had a way of transporting the hot coals to their home.
I hadn't heard that. No, this
Well,
is
how else are they gonna get them to their house?
no. It's a metaphor. It's not an actual thing that they do. I've never heard that.
I think Diane just arrived for church.
So here, if we're looking at, so at verse 10, for this reason, a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So that is talking about the custom of married women putting that veil on their head as a sign that they are married. Okay? So single women didn't have to do it. But even Paul is saying in some cultures, because remember, he's talking to Jews and Gentiles. So in some cultures, it was okay for a woman to shave her head, like Roman women did, because Roman women would wear wigs. Okay? Also, some Jewish women would do that. So there were some people that would shave their heads. There were other communities in which that was frowned upon. And so, he's trying to balance out the two. He's not trying to say one way or the other. But regardless, women have a sign of authority over them, who is their husband, right? And the respect, whether that's wearing a wig or having hair or putting on a veil or whatever, that's the sign that's the sign that she's supposed to have. But he's trying to give it a balance there culturally for the women at that time, because again, we don't struggle with veiling in our culture, so it's not a thing that needs to be addressed for us. But here at the end of the passage, Paul's also addressing that woman's hair is her glory and is a covering. Basically, God gave it to her as a blessing, not a curse, to be covered. So that's Paul's drawing that parallel. So whether you are covering it with a veil or whether it's open, it's a blessing. It's not something to be. The issue is with the heart of men, and should not be placed on the women to bear the sins of men for the world to see. When you read Paul's other writings on the law dealing with similar issues such as circumcision, you get a clear picture that he is trying to get people to separate tradition and culture from serving Jesus, and it would be to be free of the bondage of legalism, like we've been talking about in Galatians, because we are saved by grace, justified through the cross, and nothing that we do can add to it. 1 Corinthians 11:16, Paul even states that the churches should have no such traditions and that we should not argue over such matters.
Now, the Jewish men, when they prayed, they would put a shawl over their head.
Yes. They still do that.
And contradiction to it?
No, because the law says, yes, if they were believers, possibly. But here's the interesting thing is that Paul never tells Jews not to practice those things. Mm-hmm. And they never say, the Jerusalem Council doesn't ever say that Jews shouldn't adhere to the law, or to break with tradition. Rather, that tradition is filled in Christ, and that's why they say, okay, we'll go to the circumcision, you go to the uncircumcision, right? And so we still see they do that to cover their head as they're praying, because the law says men have to cover their head when they pray. So
You a Jewish guy
well, they call it a kippah, but yeah, yarmulke in
So
Yiddish.
why verse 4, which is the exact opposite of that?
What do you mean?
Every man who prays and prophesies with head covered dishonors his head.
Yeah, I don't know. But Paul, again, he's talking to Gentiles. So, yeah. But yeah, they cover their head when they pray.
You ready for another question?
Yeah, sure.
What?
There we go.
Oh, I had my question.
You've used up your quota, that's it.
All right, okay. Next time we have open questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another question. I've been reading Ezekiel,
Okay.
and it seems like it's a lot of verbiage for the message? Like, why couldn't it have been condensed to like 3 chapters instead of 50 or whatever it is? 'Cause it's repetitive, a lot of repetition.
A lot of repetition, but here's the thing you have to remember about the Jewish mind. When we, as English speakers, want to underscore a point, we typically will either put exclamation points, or we'll put it in bold, or we'll do stuff like that. We'll put it in italics, right? Because that's the way that we underscore that this is offset. It's a little different from the main body of, it stands out. Well, even like when you see quotes, sometimes quotes are, you'll have your thing here, and then the quote is kind of offset, right? To show that it's important. That's how we denote that things are important. The way that the Jewish people, the way that the Eastern mind values things as important is repetition. So the more times something is repeated, the more important it is. And then sometimes so repetition, so that's one device. That's one literary device that they use to underscore the importance of something. Another literary device that they will use is the tell-told. That's what I call it. It's a tell-told. So they'll tell you, like we see this in the Genesis account of the creation of man. They'll tell you man was created and on what day he was created, right? But then they'll go back in chapter 3 and show you the creation story again, right? So they'll tell you, and then at some point they'll remind you that they told you that, okay? So that's another way that we can see how the Jewish mind emphasizes something. The other way that they do it is through hyperbole. So we were talking about last week in Judges how sometimes numbers are inflated to ascribe more honor, more glory, more dignity to something. So like when we talked about the king who got conquered, and he said, I've cut the thumbs and the big toes off of 70 other kings. Could it really be that he did that to 70 other kings? Sure. But he's a city-state. It's not like he's got infinite number of men to draw from and to go out and conquer. So it's more likely that he's 70 is a good number. It's a holy number. It's 10 sevens. And so it's sometimes seen as a number of perfection. So it's the completeness of his conquering, not necessarily the number that he conquered. So sometimes we get those inflationary numbers, or like Shamgar, I think he kills 700 guys with an ox goad, right? In a 3-acre space or something like that. Again, probably inflationary numbers to ascribe honor and glory not only to Shamgar but to God. So, yeah.
That we understand because the news does that all the time.
We do that. I mean, we do that all the time. Like I tell Zane or whatever, I've told you 17 times already today not to do this. Maybe it's been 4.
Pick a number out of the air.
Right. My dad used to use the word umpteen.
Yeah. Yeah.
He would say, I've told you umpteen times, or if you wanted to really say something, I've told you umpteen dozen times. Right? So, yeah.
No, I just read the one chapter of the Bible that drives me crazy. Is 1 Chronicles, and right here where it's like 25:19. The first lot was for this, his sons as well as blah blah blah. All I'm saying is it goes on, and they go over here and they say blah 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 blah. Honestly, I just skip through that. I mean, it's kind of repetitious, very repetitious.
Yeah. Well, the Chronicles, you got to remember, Chronicles are chronicling the history of the Jewish people. So those are census data, that's land data, that's all stuff that we can use today to confirm the truth of the Bible.
It's not my favorite thing.
It's not, the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew is awful. I hate reading through it. But it shows the history, right? It shows, I think it's the matrilineal line, and then Luke goes through the patrilineal line, or it's the other way around. I can't remember which at the moment. But the both are very important because it shows how we got from Joseph to Jesus and how we got from Mary to Jesus. Okay? So they'll do hyperbole. Okay? This is just 3 of the main ways that they do that. And then they'll use what they call comparative degrees. So comparative degrees is, for example, this is one of my favorites. Jesus says in the Gospels, if you do not hate mother, father, brother, sister, but say you love me, you cannot be my disciple. All right? Is he saying you really have to hate mother, father, brother, sister? No. What he's saying is if the love that you have for me does not make the love that you have for your family look like hate, you cannot be my disciple. Okay? So he's using comparative degrees there. When Paul says, or when Paul is quoting Esau I have loved, or Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Again, he's talking in comparative degrees. So in Ezekiel, the reason there's so much repetition is probably the repetition to underscore an important point. This is like, it's like a neon sign pointing to how important this thing is. It's the tell told. So he'll tell you what he's going to tell you. He'll explain it. And then at one point later, he'll reference, it's like a callback almost, back to that scene. Okay? Then there's a lot of hyperbole. There's going to be a lot of comparative degrees. Okay? So, yeah. Ezekiel is one of those weird books that does that. Okay? It's a lot of the same vision. It's a lot of takes on the same vision because in each of those, he focuses on a slightly different thing. But it's that repetition. God, I want you to pay attention is what he's trying to tell the Jewish people.
This is in many ways parable is kind of like that.
Parables, yep.
You tell a different story but make it more interesting because you keep saying one thing with the same idea.
Yep.
It gets really boring, you know.
So here's how parables work. I think we've talked about this before. Parables are didactic, it's a teaching story, right? And so there are forms of stories that we know. And all of the stories that we tell fit into those forms. All right? And so I think we mentioned this, the different forms of stories. Let me pull this in my notes up. All right. So there are 7 main forms that we have as storytellers. Okay? And this isn't on the Western side of things, but even this is just as humanity is concerned. There's the overcoming the monster. What is one of the famous overcoming the monster stories? Yes, there you go. Beowulf. Overcoming the monster. Who said another one?
Jack and the Beanstalk.
Jack and the Beanstalk. Great overcoming the monster story. So there's that. There's the rags to riches story.
Cinderella.
Yep. Oliver Twist. Right. There is the quest. This is Lord of the Rings. In fact, Lord of the Rings has a lot of the overcoming the monster in it too, but it's mainly about the quest. Right? King Arthur and his lot. There is the Voyage and Return, Gulliver's Travels, Romeo, the Odyssey, Pilgrim's Progress, sure. And, yeah, Moby Dick. That's definitely an overcoming. The monster wasn't really overcome though.
Yes.
He was overcome by the monster. Ahab was.
Who was really the monster?
Yeah, who was really the monster? That really. Then there's the comedy. Okay. There's the tragedy. Romeo and Juliet. Say it again?
How about right wins out over wrong?
Sometimes it doesn't happen, though.
Well, it's true, but it's a storytelling form.
It can be a storytelling form, but sometimes right doesn't overcome wrong in some of these stories. So, like, for example, in, we'll say as a version of the quest, there's the Count of Monte Cristo.
Yes.
Right? At first, the protagonist really wants to reclaim his lost love. He wants to right the wrongs that have been done to him, and ends up turning into the very monster that his antagonist was.
Yeah.
And so he sets out with a righteous goal to right the wrongs that were done to him, right overcoming wrong. But and then he becomes the wrong that he so despises in the end.
And Narnia would be the quest as well.
Narnia would also be a quest. There's that's maybe the overarching theme of the whole the series. But then, like the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is Voyage and Return. The Lion, the Witch, and their Wardrobe is about overcoming the monster. Yeah.
And which was the comedy one?
Comedy. I didn't really do comedy, but that could be like Figaro. That whole what is the name of that opera? La, da, 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 da. Anyway, is that the? Oh my gosh,
Midsummer's Night.
Midsummer Night Dream. Yep, that's a great comedy. The Marriage of Figaro. Okay, it's a great comedy.
The marriage agreement?
The Marriage of Figaro.
Oh,
It's an opera. It's hilarious. Then there's The Magic Flute, which is another great comedy.
Where's romance fit into this?
Romance is another one. They don't have it on here, but romance kind of encapsulates all of these things. You find romance in like tragedy, for example. Romeo and Juliet is a romance that falls into a tragedy. Romance, you have the quest to save the princess from the monster. So yeah, romance kind of fits into all of those. But then finally, you've got rebirth. My marker's running out here. So Aladdin is a great rebirth story, but it's also a rags to riches story. I think Disney's Aladdin.
The difference between the two is, I mean, rags to riches is a rebirth.
Sort of, but rags to riches can also be its own thing. You're not necessarily becoming a different person, but you're coming out of the gutter. The great rebirth story, for example, is Scrooge.
How about Beauty and the Beast?
Beauty and the Beast would be overcoming the monster. Yeah, so that's overcoming the monster. But it's got that romance element to it. So romance definitely, I mean, you put an eighth type up here as romance, but romance definitely fits into all these different things. So we have these natural things, these natural forms of stories that we tell. In Jewish thought and in Jewish parables, there are forms of stories that they tell. And when I did that series through some of the parables, we saw that, for example, the prodigal son is the form of a story, a parable, that was already existing in Jewish culture. And so Jesus is appropriating some of those and is using a form that people are familiar with, just like we would use the quest or overcoming the monster, to using that form that everybody knows and then slightly changing it. The wedding feast is another great example of a parable type or form that we find in Jewish writing that Jesus is now appropriating and using to teach the gospel. Okay? There are a bunch of other ones that he does too, that he's just borrowing these forms. So sometimes we think that Jesus is making these things up on the fly. He's not necessarily making these things up on the fly. He's a Pharisee. He's been trained. He knows the forms and stories that people are familiar with. A lot of his stories, a lot of the stories, even the parables in the Jewish writings, there's a lot about farms and vineyards because Israel is described as a vineyard. And so a lot of those parables that Jesus tells are coming from these Jewish story forms that he's using because people will latch onto them and remember them because they're the story forms that they're used to hearing. Does that make sense?
Okay, it is high noon. We won't tax your voice any further.
It lasted longer than I thought it would.
Although you did rev up.
Huh?
Said you revved up.
Yeah.
Voice got stronger.
But hopefully that's all helpful.